Oh, of course. Wow, that's a great.
I brought my class.
I mean, the top of the.
I teach it this time, so, and 5 of them are actually. Six of them are here.
I don't promise that I'm taking anything.
Shannon? Hi, my name's Chris. Rose. Nice to meet you. I'm in biology.
I'll let you guys know. What's that?
Is this the coincide?
This is, yes. I just let you guys know there's a camera right here, so if you're sitting in these chairs, be careful not to.
One or more.
Okay, I lost it.
Well, Frankenstein I used in the past, and I mentioned it in other classes. And Bladerunner.
They have like a little. We have microwave. And there's.
I'm moderating, so I will only interject if there's something more.
Okay.
But I've taught Frankenstein, Bladerunner, 2001, and neither was
He's building new or no?
Oh, so you're pretty well sorted.
Like, I don't know what I got, though. It wasn't your last one.
What do you think?
And it's 200. That was
Hello.
Nice also amazing that.
Do you know who you remind me of?
Yeah.
You remind me of did you watch How to Get Away with Murder? I just started. I just started this weekend. I've like.
I wondered too though when
It's awesome.
Yeah.
because I know that it takes like
Portal Lost.
films like
You know, like perfect lighter, but you and the personality and the
Well,
mannerisms.
Night of the Living Dead, that was pretty quick.
was it okay.
Yeah. That was like 30 days or something.
Like your sweater. This one.
Picked the best actors to do it. 2001, Kubrick and Clark worked together for a year.
On Netflix.
So that's what the book
I just started watching
the mannerisms and big shape.
It's like, it's about Mary Queen of Scots. You're just married. Mary Queen of Scotland. They solve a real little
This is me. So, was everyone's day then?
Undergrad.
Hey everybody. Well, thanks for coming to the lecture. My name is Phil. I'm one of the presenters. I'll be talking about the HAL 8000 computer and 2001 Space Odyssey. Thanks for being here.
We're excited.
Excellent. Maybe next time we'll hear from you. You guys can present. We don't
know as much. We'd rather hear from you guys. Maybe.
You know everything about like anime and manga though, right?
Yeah.
So,
Not quite.
I don't
Movies,
know
maybe. That's more my line, so.
I'm sorry?
I'm more into movies, so.
So like anime.
Not quite. Yeah.
We watch it all the time. Went through a phase.
You went through a phase. I've never been to an anime phase. It's not. I've watched anime movies, but my favorite genre. It'd be cool to draw.
Like Studio Ghibli, whatever you want to call it, that's classic stuff.
Oh yeah. Totoro. Kiki's Delivery. Oh yeah.
There's one movie that's a super classic one.
It's so much better.
Oh really? There's a book?
Excuse me. Sorry.
Meaning a book, not like.
I moved over here.
Continuously like right now, like right on camera. Yeah, it's being live streamed.
Oh, it's being live streamed?
Yes.
Noted. Bye. Noted.
Oh, we're taking a picture? No. Oh.
You were a late comer to it.
Yes, I read Space Odyssey. Bladerunner I saw, but probably wasn't that impressed when I saw it in the movies.
Perfect.
So I read
It's really good. That's not a big deal. That's like a big living, right? Yeah.
Well, that's why I took away that, which was the theory to make it more powerful. Maybe it doesn't touch upon it.
So it's inspired by a short story.
That was the first turn off.
Don't get into it like some go to the movie whole thing.
There's plenty of seats up here. If you want to come up front,
When it's Space
we'll be
Odyssey.
talking from back here.
Short story.
Or you can stay there, that's fine too. Help yourselves to snack.
Like six crisscross applesauce.
It's a bit long,
Thanks for coming. Bye.
You said you're going to ask questions. And that was the end of that.
Now, some are doing one. People have a real interest in doing this.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to walk someone who actually wants to ask a question. I feel like real people should sit there. I'm with Casey. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Wait, instead of a letter?
Yeah.
Oh, about the thing.
Yeah. I think we'll probably get it.
Did we get my phone back?
It's been a while.
But my computer is
That's right for I didn't get that.
I think we should work together.
You're also on the panel on
Rich.
Rich.
I don't know.
These are regular.
Illustration.
Are you asking if they're original?
Pop culture.
There's plenty of seats up front.
We go from the work print and
You don't have any.
release.
Right on it. Oh, yeah.
The work print.
Very polite.
Yeah, what's called temperature.
One of our lungs.
So,
Oh, no.
so that's
One of our lungs.
It would be like going
I know, I am.
Blu-ray set. And work print is there. Stackers. I see the pen works of the replicant.
Yeah, which I think also when people first watch it, they
We're. This is lower school, like most of the time, they might know everybody up there.
I just like nothing until completely disconnected from it.
Well, welcome. My name is Michael Klein. I'm director of the Cohen Center for the Humanities, and this is our wonderful space that we have here in Madison Hall. I want to thank you all for coming out for our roundtable talk, Sentient, Selves, Pop Culture Considers the Human. Oh, good, I remember the title. We went through quite a few iterations. This was all my fault that we had this, because back in February I'm like, oh wow, Frankenstein, 200 years old. We should do something for that. This is a work that I used in my own dissertation, and just something I've been really drawn to. And then looking at other pieces of pop culture that had their 50th anniversaries in '68, we found a wealth of those, and they all resonated with one another because of the idea of what it is to be human. But I couldn't do it without these lovely folks here who decided they were going to just climb on board and be part of the roundtable, and so I really appreciate that. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, and they're going to speak briefly about what draws them to science fiction and horror, either to one of these specific works or to the genres in general. I'll then ask them a series of questions that hopefully will get an organic conversation going. And then finally at the end, we're going to open it up to the audience to ask questions, make comments, engage in the conversation. All right, well, let us begin.
Hi everyone, my name is Shaun White. I'm an assistant professor in integrated science and technology. Specifically, my role within ISAT, as we call it, is to work with our science, technology, and engineering students around questions related to ethics, policy, and the broader social context related issues of emerging science and technology. So I always like to joke with my colleagues that I got the fun job. So I work hand in hand, side by side, team teaching with scientists and technologists from a wide array of disciplines. So things are always fun and I'm always learning. But what has really drawn me to science fiction and thinking about Frankenstein in particular is that it's such a wonderful tool for me to use with my students in my 100 level science, technology, and society class, where we use Frankenstein as a tool for really thinking about responsible innovation. What does it mean to be a responsible practitioner of science and technology? And so we really dive deep into Frankenstein. We apply the JMU 8 key questions in different ways, exploring the different ways in which Victor could have really changed paths so many different times in his journey. And so it's a lot of fun to work with the students. And one of our culminating exercises is we actually put Victor Frankenstein on trial. The students get to pretend that they're lawyers and the creature and Victor, and we use the Belmont report to essentially try him, in terms of his what he's done in terms of violating the rights of human subjects. And so I just find that it's a wonderful teaching tool, and I'm doing some research right now kind of analyzing pre and post data from my students in terms of how has Frankenstein helped shape their definitions of what it means to be a responsible innovator. And then also, like Michael, Frankenstein was integrated into my dissertation as well. My background's in political science, and I studied the governance of assisted reproductive technologies. And I'm particularly interested in what we call the anticipatory governance of new and emerging technologies. So how can we look ahead and think proactively about technologies? And one of the areas of research that I did was looking into how works of science fiction, such as Frankenstein and Brave New World, can serve as catalysts for discussion around technologies such as reproductive technologies, and kind of exploring monstrous motifs as they have evolved over time, and how the monster has kind of played into debates around reproductive tech over time. So I think I went on a little too long, so I'll let Chris take it away.
Thanks, Shannon. My name's Chris Rose. I'm in the biology department. I teach courses on animal development and experimental research with vertebrate embryos. I do a course on human development and evolution, an honors class called Biology in the Movies. So I'm interested in science in very broad perspective. As a teacher, my research is specifically on things like its anatomy and evolution, evolution of how body parts change in amphibians. Amphibians have a metamorphosis. They can also regenerate. They can also change the way they develop in response to the environmental conditions. So there's lots of plasticity and flexibility in how body form is realized in this animal group, and I guess that's the closest my research actually comes to things like cloning and playing around with human identity and stuff. But as I say, my teaching interests allow you a lot more flexibility to explore topics because you don't have to deal with the ethical constraints of what you're doing with embryos in a lab. I mean, I'd never want to try to do cloning myself. And in teaching, even in my fundamentals course, animal development, in the first week we're learning about the importance of where you are in history to understand developmental mechanisms, biological mechanisms, and Frankenstein is an example I mentioned. In the 1700s, 1800s, people are trying to come to grips with the universal forces that define how all the phenomena in the natural world, all the phenomena work. And you know, Newton had come up with gravitation as a first law sort of 150 years before Mary Shelley, and in her day, when she was a kid, I think her dad was a well-known surgeon in London and invited probably a lot of the practicing well-known scientists over for dinner, and at that time people were literally doing the research of sticking electrodes into frog muscles and making them twitch. And learning about electromagnetism at that time. So it wasn't a big leap for her to take that force and think about it in a biological context as perhaps a unique version of electricity was what created life and separated life from non-organic material. And so in her dream, that's probably what seemed like a very convenient mechanism to for her doctor to bring animal, dead material back to life. You could make it, and of course it wasn't until many years later that they discovered nuclear forces and ultimately ruled out any kind of vitalistic or essentialist force that was specific to life. That now we realize that life will be explained at a most reductionist level by the same forces that pertain to all other matter in the universe. Of course, there's a lot more to understand about life than just how molecules bang together. But and thinking about Bladerunner, which is the other movie that features in my classes, again, it's a product of the science of the times. I mean, solid-state electronics and computer transistors, the beginning of what we now call chips, but also assembly line production and thinking about robots in the home. This was what was in everybody's minds in the 1950s and 60s. So to come up with a future where a society was generating all kinds of human-like robots to carry out all the functions, the things that humans didn't want to do, wasn't that far-fetched. But where Philip K. Dick went further than everyone else was thinking about if you have enough computing sophistication, enough complexity in the hardware, and you develop a sufficiently malleable software that allows individuals to learn from experience and from social interaction, then accidents can happen, and the accidents of becoming more human than their producers ever intended. And so that was, I think, his vision, and of course it's carried out in a much more structured and gripping narrative in the film. But it's something that kind of took us further ahead. We weren't ready to think like that at that time, nor were people in the 1820s ready to think like that. They still weren't ready in the 1930s when the movie came along. So I like to point out scientific relevance to these to these stories, but also explore them for their rhetoric, what the stories in the movies tell us about humankind. I guess I've probably gone over my time too. Sorry, go ahead.
That's great, Chris. I'm learning things about my colleagues. This is great. So I'll be brief. My name is Phil Frana. I'm the Associate Dean and Associate Professor in the Honors College. I got my start at the Charles Babbage Institute. Charles Babbage is like the 19th century steampunk inventor of big iron computing. That's at the University of Minnesota. And I was trained as a historian of computing, worked on an NSF project documenting the history of computer software for a number of years. Computer software, believe it or not, is 60, 70 years old at this point. If you're not counting like Jacquard looms and punch cards and that sort of thing, real code is that old now. And I teach in the Honors College now, so I can't teach anything like that because there are only a couple dozen people in the world that are probably interested in software studies. So for undergraduates, I teach classes in things like the artificial other, minds, machines, and meaning. That would be a very interdisciplinary kind of course that I teach in the Honors College. Or automation and the future of work. Those are the kinds of offerings that I make available to students these days. I'm going to be talking about 2001: A Space Odyssey. First saw the film in its entirety with a group of STS friends, Science and Technology Studies friends at the Midwest Junto, they mispronounce it, for the history of science in Norman, Oklahoma. And I remember sitting around and having this very long conversation with ice cream and beer during the movie and after. My father's a really big science fiction fan. He made me watch every episode of a PBS series called Watch the Skies. I don't know if you guys remember this from the 70s and 80s, but basically every Friday night they'd show some movie. Sometimes they were good, sometimes they were like B movies, sometimes they seemed like C movies. And that was sort of my education. Yeah, oh yeah, Doctor Who, yeah, and then Red Dwarf, right? Also in the 90s. So I've got one of the largest science fiction anthology collections in the state of Virginia. The largest one in the world is actually in Virginia in private hands. Mine's not that big, but I'm working on it. I'm also, if you're interested later and you want to connect to this organization, I'm on the advisory board of the Museum of Science Fiction down in Washington, D.C. They don't have a facility yet, but it's going to be like International Spy. There's a site that's been picked out on Anacostia Flats down there by the stadium. And for now, the museum is hosting a spring conference. It's every Memorial Day at National Harbor, and it's called Escape Velocity. And if you're interested in attending or participating or volunteering, there are all kinds of opportunities. Michael knows what I mean by that. It's like I pull everybody in because it's an organization that's only 3 years old at this point. So you can still get in on the ground floor and do some exciting things. So that's how I got interested in this.
Hi, I'm Richard Hilliard, Associate Professor of Graphic Design and Illustration in the School of Art and Design and Art History. And I guess for good or ill, I'm the JMU faculty expert on pop culture. My history with all these properties go pretty far back. I can't lay claim to having seen the James Whale 1931 Frankenstein in its original release, but I did see it in 1966. My mother took me to the theater for a matinee. It was a double feature of Whale's Frankenstein and Dracula with Bela Lugosi. And after the films were over, we walked out into the bright sunlight and I was covered in chicken pox. So I had bloomed during the course of the films. Then 2 years later, I saw Planet of the Apes, 2001: Space Odyssey, and Night of the Living Dead on their original release. Night of the Living Dead at the drive-in. I'm a Valley kid originally, grew up on the other side of the mountain near Luray, and saw 2001: Space Odyssey and Planet of the Apes here in Harrisonburg. Planet of the Apes was the first time I had buttered popcorn. I was 6 years old. My grandmother took me to see it at the State Theater, while my parents went to the Virginia Theater, which was where next to Jess's Quick Lunch. And they saw Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, which I was not allowed to see. My mother having made a terrible mistake in taking me to see Psycho when I was 4. And then Bladerunner in its original theatrical release, 1982. And so I'm pretty conversant in all of the filmed versions of these properties, but I guess mostly I'll hold forth on Planet of the Apes.
Wow, when I was 4, I rode Space Mountain twice at Disneyland, and I think I watched Poltergeist. That's my I'm Shaun White. It's quite scarring, yeah. I'm Shaun White. I'm an associate professor of English, and my specialty has nothing to do with Frankenstein, really. I specialize in early 20th century British and Irish literature. I have an Irish studies specialty, but I do teach the survey of English Lit, the second half of the survey, and I teach Mary Shelley after having talked about a bunch of male romantic poets and the way that their romanticism critiques Enlightenment rationality. And then I say, and it's all about the romantic, emotional individual, the rugged individual, usually male, who's tromping around in the the Lake District, talking about stuff. So then I teach Mary Shelley is coming along and saying, you scientists are not doing the right thing, and neither are you, romantic individualists. You're screwing things up. Particularly for those who are marked as othered in the text, other gender, other rationality, non-human. So I think about it specifically in a gender context, but also in a kind of politics of othering. So yeah, that's, one of the things I guess I'll say, just to throw it out there, when we're in the class, it's a class this semester of 300 students, and we spend a fair amount of time talking about what makes something human and what makes something non-human, and we usually center on consciousness, self-awareness, the consciousness of being responsible to a society, and of empathy. And everyone agrees that the creature has all of those characteristics, and that mostly what makes him monstrous is his appearance. Been there, right? Sorry. Differently, but his appearance, and also the acts that he takes out of a rage that's been built by the way he was raised, or rather not raised. So this idea that monstrosity is socially constructed as opposed to innate. And I think that's important. So I'll throw that out there.
Thank you. So we live in a culture, society, where 15 minutes is like a long time. And to pay attention for more than 15 minutes we find is harder and harder. And then we're here today and we're talking about works that are 50 years old, in the case of Frankenstein are 200 years old. What gives them their longevity?
I'll jump in. I think there's so many different layers to these things, and listening to the literary analysis, and then I come to Frankenstein from a more visual perspective, and the iconography that has been built primarily in Hollywood, because if you read the novel, the construction of the monster and the way it's reanimated is told in very vague terms, and it's just a device to get to the main narrative. Would you agree with that?
The construction of the creature?
Of the creature, yeah. It's kind of sketched in, and there's no the equipment and the lightning and sparks and all the other things are all constructs of Hollywood, and those visual things add layers to the
to that in the novel, to actually how
right.
the internal machinations of
There's so much great stuff in that, and I go to one of the sequels which is the ghost of Frankenstein, which I believe is 1941. And Bela Lugosi plays Igor, which had never existed before. And he said, the monster is brought out of the sulfur pit from which he vanished in Bride of Frankenstein, or rather in Son of Frankenstein. And then he's just kind of lumbering around at half capacity, and then he gets struck by lightning. And Igor is just amazed, and he says, as Bela Lugosi could say, he goes, "Your father was Frankenstein, but your mother was the lightning." So there's all that, and then that's just another layer on top of this vast wealth of subtext that's available in Mary Shelley's prose.
I have to jump on that if you don't mind.
No.
This idea, I love that idea that the narrative as it continues out into film and popular culture is looking for the mother, because one of the things that's really, really unnatural about what Victor Frankenstein does, in addition to digging up body parts and suturing them together, is to try and remove the mother from the creation process, and to remove sex from the creation process, which is probably the most fun part of the creation process. I don't know why he wants to do that, but there's this idea of wanting to be the central creator instead of doing it the kind of natural way. So, and to me, that's that whole concept of what's the relationship of the thing, the creator to the creation, is the thing that threads through the entire novel and makes it relevant to today. Like what we produce, we're responsible for it when it goes out in the world, and also we can't control it when it goes out in the world. And I think that, especially in the sort of social media age, is a really important lesson.
Yeah, and to just kind of jump on, the themes related to, motherhood and creation, many scholars have said that Frankenstein, in a sense, is a birth myth that has been generated by Mary Shelley that really kind of touches on a lot of her own trauma. Her mother died when she was born, and so she kind of bore that guilt, as the result of that, union between her father and her mother. And then she experienced a lot of miscarriages as well in her young life, and I believe that she was pregnant while she was writing the novel. And so these themes of birth and creation and death and parenthood all like really intermingle and manifest themselves in different ways in the narrative and in a really poignant way. And so you kind of have to wonder, as she's sketching out these characters, to what extent is she kind of living in them. From her own perspective as a mother who has had children die, and as the result of a birth in which her own mother died. But in many ways, I think in addition to being a birth myth, Frankenstein has been called by scholars the first myth of modern times. Folks have called it, and like you were saying, the relationship between the creator and the created, it goes all the way back to the ancients. Almost every civilization has some kind of mythology around the creator and the created, and she harkens to that with the subtitle of the book, The Modern Prometheus.
And then there's also the legend of the golem, which is a Jewish myth about a rabbi who can create a man out of clay, and using the Kabbalah brings him to life, and then the creation goes on a rampage and destroys all the persecutors of the Jews. Bad news is, when he's done with them, he turns on the creators.
But the real, it's certainly a modern myth and a modern Prometheus, but it's, from a scientist point of view, it's most important because it's the first time people are messing with our existence using science. I mean, it's explicitly science.
Yes.
And up until then, it's more mythological. Either there's certain superpowers out there being bestowed by gods, or in the case of the golem, somehow through the clay, but in a supernatural way. And now this is science. And I mean, I like your point about the lightning and a lot of spectacle being added to the creation aspect of it, because in her original version, and it's only returned to, I think, by Kenneth Branagh's version, it's electrochemistry that is the source of the animating energy. It's literally bathing the body in a solution of charged ions and having metals with different affinity, and that will generate, this is the beginning of a battery. This was the science that they were talking about at that time. But the two metals creating a current through the liquid. And of course, there's no sound effect there, there's no light effect, it's just something happening in a closed container. And yet that was sufficient to be this animating force for an 1820s audience. It wasn't sufficient for a 1930s audience.
One of the things that Victor talks about in his development too, in terms of the scientific community, is he goes to one professor and asks him, I really want to do something new, and the guy tells him this, well, the scientists have done this, you have to sort of build on this line of thinking that's developed. But he doesn't like that guy's answer, and frankly thinks he's a goofy looking professor. And so he goes to a better looking professor, weirdly, who's distinguished with gray hair. That appearance thing seems to be really important to him, and follows that line, and he just sort of ignores the learning over here, which of course is another cautionary tale with science, right? Would be to don't ignore the experiments that go horribly wrong, and if you do, you'll have terrible consequences with
And that mentorship is important.
Yes.
You should engage with your community. Science doesn't happen in isolation. There's a community, and that's one of the issues with Victor is he goes off on his own in his colored dorm room, basically, to do this stuff. Never bothers to tell his professors what he's doing.
Right.
Never tells his family.
Right.
So,
The strong-willed and really, really stubborn, and thus he becomes the model for the inhuman scientist, the caricature, the archetype for it.
Right.
And then we play that forward to Eldon Tyrell in Bladerunner, who has created this immense corporate structure that is building slaves for the off-world colonies, and more human than human. And just like in the modern Prometheus, just like in the Golem, the creation turns on the creator. When Roy Batty confronts Eldon Tyrell in his bedchambers in Bladerunner.
Terminator 2. Also. Terminator 2 was kind of weak, but Terminator also.
Westworld.
Yeah.
Sure.
How about a Space Odyssey?
So, HAL 9000 may turn on the humans too, although I think it's justifiable. In the book, he had good reasons for doing so. The humans couldn't be trusted with the truth. In the book, the humans are xenophobic. They were tested on Earth, and all humans were found to be psychologically incapable of encountering an extraterrestrial intelligence. And so only HAL could be trusted with the true knowledge of the mission, and that's why everything goes awry in the story, because HAL's got these conflicting instructions that he's trying to reconcile. And so I'm very sympathetic to the Golem, I guess, in this construction. To the original question about the popularity of these films, I had to go and do a little research, and there's a way on Internet Movie Database to see how these movies have fared over time. You can look at their rankings from inception back in 1996 to the present. And I had to go back and search my memory, because there's been some waxing and waning in the films we're talking about here. 2001, for example, was never more popular than when that service launched in the 90s. So first 25 years, very popular film, ranked 25 in 1996 on that list of top 250 movies. But since then, pretty much steady decline, and now hovering around somewhere like 100, which is kind of shocking. So it's not as popular as the other things we're talking about here by a long shot. Even though Kubrick's got 7 films in the top 250, this isn't his top film by a long shot. I had to think about, why is that? And I think the answer is that we've already achieved the vision of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Just hear me out. So the movie really started kind of tanking in the ratings in the early aughts. And the reason is, we went to space, right? We did that in the 60s. And when this movie came out, we hadn't landed on the moon quite yet. We were just about to do that. So we've been there, we've done that. There's nothing out there, there's nobody out there, there's nothing to really do, maybe harvest some asteroids. Computer lip reading's trivial. Now machine learning algorithms can actually put words in people's mouths and make them say, make Obama say things that he never said. Chatbots, by many accounts, have passed the Turing test in the Loebner Prize competitions. That's been done. Deep Blue beat the chess champion Gary Kasparov. I couldn't believe this when I did the math. 21 years ago now? 21 years ago. And there's that scene in 2001 where there's this, you know, the human, I think it's Frank Poole's playing chess, right, against Hal. He sort of gives up at some point. People are like, shocked, shocked, shocked. The machine has beat the human at chess. And now we've got, you know, Watson beating Ken Jennings at Jeopardy. That was 7 years ago now. DeepMind beating the best Go player in the world with AlphaGo. We've got Deep Thunder now, which can do local, precise weather forecasting, like down to the hour. So Saturday, we can know precisely everything we need to know about the weather during the game. That can be done now. The Blue Brain project, where they're trying to emulate a rat's brain and then a human brain. I guess a human will pop out at some point. There's this thing called Jill Watson, named after IBM Watson, that's like an artificial intelligence tutor. It's a teaching machine. And the monolith is essentially a teaching machine for humanity. So all of these things have kind of been done. And so I kind of feel like that's the strength and the weakness of the legacy of this movie, is that it's no longer this visionary film about the future, that by 2000 it had already happened, and now we've got a movie on our hands about the near past that just happened.
I'd like to build on something Phil was talking about briefly. If you look at the image there, 2001, that I did earlier this year, you see the pod going into the monolith, essentially kind of like opening the Stargate. And Phil was talking about that Hal knew the truth, and the astronauts, the explorers, did not. And spoiler alert, I hate to do this, but Hal systematically kills the crew, leaving only Dave Bowman at the end. And one of my takeaways from watching 2001 X number of times is that I believe that Hal is actually a tool of the monolith. Yeah. That this is natural selection. That the monolith has pushed Hal's button to finding the alpha.
To me, it's bigger than that.
Okay.
It's the monolith appears back at the time of Homo erectus, I guess, or pre-Homo sapiens, and I mean the moment of transmission of information then is a bone is now a tool, and then it's flying in the air.
And a tool of destruction.
Yeah, it's a tool of destruction, but it is a tool. And then to go from that clip of the bone revolving in the air to the spaceship revolving in the air is to say that all you needed was a seed of wisdom to start technology, and the rest is an inevitability. You will get to this artificial machine through the intelligent species, and then it's the monolith is ready to resume its story with us, and we're only a tool of its story.
Well, apparently that spacecraft that's orbiting, you don't know this from the visuals of the film, but apparently that's supposed to be an orbiting nuclear weapon. Okay. So the bone, the tool of the early man sequence, the proto-humans are starving, and then the monolith appears and gives them the impetus to kill for food, and also kill their enemies, their rivals at the watering hole. Right. Okay. And then the bone goes in the air and turns into this orbiting nuclear device. And in that one fell swoop, all of our evolution, all of our technology, all of our strides in art are rendered meaningless. We've gone from A to B, not A to Z, A to B.
Which suggests that there's way more out in the future.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the things that I think a number of these pieces are, I haven't seen Planet of the Apes, but a number of them are talking about, or pushing on the idea that scientific progress and human progress and evolution, that they're all heading toward a clear good. That we can continue to fix the imperfections, improve upon them using a machine, for example, or just, improve upon creation by, skipping the sex part or whatever, and just get to the good part, which I don't obviously agree with, but that idea that progress is a good, that if there's something you can do, you should, because you can, which leaves out the whole ethical piece of it. Yeah.
Planet of the Apes is the flip side of 2001, because 2001 ends on this hopeful note. the star child, the next step in evolution. Planet of the Apes is beware the beast man. For he among God's primates kills for lust, or sport, or greed. And that's from the 13th scroll, for those of you who are not up on here. You're Dr. Zayas, but Planet of the Apes, you've got a group of explorers, in this case 3 males, 1 female, leaving the Earth, going to find a new hospitable planet to start a colony. They go through this device called a Hassline curve, and again, spoiler alert, end up thousands of years in the future, and on a planet where apes speak, apes have a civilization, and humans are a pest to be eradicated, or best experimented on, or stuffed and mounted in museums.
They devolved.
Yes.
They can't even speak anymore. Not really.
Yeah, they just grunt. And the Taylor character, now back a little bit, talk about the literary beginnings. Planet of the Apes is based on a piece of Swiftian satire written by Pierre Boulle, a French novelist. The original title is Le Planète des Singes, which is Monkey Planet. And one of his minor works, his most well-known work, is Bridge over the River Kwai. And when Arthur Jacobs optioned Planet of the Apes to turn it into a film, Boulle said, I'll take your money, but I think you're crazy. And then it became this massive, decades-spanning franchise, the first big science fiction franchise, predating Star Wars. If it hadn't been for the success of Planet of the Apes, Star Wars would have never happened. That's a story for another day. And but the character of George Taylor is a man who is so disenchanted with humanity that he chooses to leave it, literally leave the earth and humanity behind, hoping to find something better, and then becomes the defender of humanity in this crazy flip role reversal.
In that flip role reversal, though, isn't it just the apes taking on what we think of as human characteristics, at least in terms of language?
Oh.
And the way that we know that the humans have devolved is just that they sound like beasts to us now, but it maintains the same hierarchy?
True, but the people really are the beasts. Again, the big spoiler alert is they're not on another planet at all. They're on Earth. And the final scene, and massive spoiler alert, in my opinion, the greatest ending of any film ever, the mind blower of mind blowers, is Taylor and his newfound love, Nova, who is one of the humans, escape from the apes. They're taking a horse down a shoreline. They come around a corner and are confronted with the destroyed remains of the Statue of Liberty. And here we have Charlton Heston, who's played Moses and Ben-Hur and El Cid and all these very Judeo-Christian characters, goes down on his hands and knees and says, God damn you all to hell. And that was a big thing, and they wanted to censor that out. But he wasn't blaspheming. He was asking the Almighty to send his damnation on all of humanity for destroying what we had built.
And the Statue of Liberty is the symbol of what we had built. A French statue.
From a French author.
From a French author, right.
But it's an implication that humans destroyed. How exactly the transition from a human-dominated world to an ape-dominated is not really explained in that original. I mean, it's played out over.
Yeah, it's played out over the
movies.
sequels,
Yeah.
but you know, there's a lot of exposition in that final thing, and he connects the dots by saying, "You maniacs, you blew it up," meaning that there was a nuclear Armageddon.
Right.
So.
So it was in the later movies where, and I'm not
It's
familiar
okay.
with Planet of the Apes.
Why I'm here?
It's in the later films where it's kind of demonstrated what the humans actually did to the apes.
Well, yeah, explicitly in the second film, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, which is, a lot of people don't like it. I find it a kind of a rousing piece of pulp science fiction. You find out that there are still intelligent humans, but they live underground. They're horribly mutated from generations, millennia of radiation, because they're in close proximity to their god, the Alpha Omega bomb, which is the doomsday bomb, the one nuclear weapon that when detonates will actually split the planet in two and destroy it.
So this kind of starts this vision of the future, dystopic vision of post-apocalyptic, where we have, I mean, the original model is a nuclear explosion, radiation, and if we survive, there's a minority that's healthy, and then some bizarre, disease-afflicted zombie crowd that, you know, it persists throughout science fiction from the 70s onwards. And it's really, we're all in recovery phase after this. It's just hunkering down for survival. This is a movie where another species gets to ascend. But I agree with you that they're really just following in our model. They're not doing anything too dramatically different, at least in the 1960s or 70s worldview. Now, if we were going to write that story now, it would be interesting to see what kind of model we want the apes to be pursuing.
Well, they're doing it. You know,
They're doing it, yeah.
And
yeah.
they're taking it in a kind of the agrarian, very, what am I looking for? Just eco-friendly kind of thing that they're trying to establish. But
Is this in
the newer ones, yeah.
So the apes aren't just bloodthirsty?
Well, I mean, they're not bloodthirsty in the original. There's a caste system. There's the orangutans are the intellectuals. The chimpanzees are the technicians and the scientists, and then the gorillas are they're military. They're the bloodthirsty ones. And actually, you know, the chimpanzees are the ones who befriend Taylor and help him to escape. And that sets a whole other plot in motion.
If they had known about bonobos, then it might have been a very a different society. Yeah.
You've touched upon this a little bit, but let's focus on the idea. Well, what do these say about the human condition? These works. What makes a human human, as opposed to a monstrosity?
Well, I think it's they're all making a comment about how easy it is to destroy what makes us human, or lose sight of it. Whether they exactly tell us what they are. I mean, especially the zombie movies, Night of the Living Dead. It's all about personifications of threats coming out of the night to destroy us in our most vulnerable ways, right? For our vulnerabilities.
And so many of them are about how we screw up and eat ourselves, basically.
And how we other and don't empathize. Like you were mentioning earlier, the othering element emerges from so many of these narratives in different ways.
It could be, humans are the monstrosity.
Yeah.
They're the monster, right? In 2001, I think Hal is more human than the human characters, and that was deliberate. Kubrick sort of fed the actors their lines one by one. They didn't really know what they were doing, what they were performing in this film, so that they would look sort of stilted and rushed, and like they're kind of they're sort of rough and brash, and Hal's so smooth and sweet and accommodating and friendly.
His voice is like,
and they just, yeah.
That's
That's it.
right?
It's like honey.
Yeah.
It's like honey. Everybody thinks it's so scary, but it's like, I don't know, maybe this is really speaking to the anti-human condition that we all live in. I went back and I watched 2001 for research purposes. And
Always fun when you can do that.
yeah. And, it got me thinking about, there's a great line in a book called The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester that popped into my head. It's just so I get it right here. The great majority of people live the sort of linear life that could easily be programmed into a computer. And I'm watching this film, and that idea popped into my head again, that like most of us have these sort of like rituals that we follow throughout our days that are rather algorithmic. We get out of bed, we brush our teeth, go to the bathroom, not necessarily in that order, but we've got an order, right? We hop in the shower, we towel off, we hop in the car, we drive here, we're on the clock all day long, 9:05, I'm from here, and then we go home and we repeat it day after day after day after day. So we're kind of machines ourselves. It's like the 20th century project. It's been made manifest. Our job is to turn people into machines, right? Cogs in the wheel in the factory. And thank God there are people in Korea trying to turn machines into people. It looks creepy to us, but you know, that might actually be more meaningful than what we've been doing here in the United States.
You see that theme of, you know, we go through our daily circuit, we go through our daily motions, you know, again in Westworld, one of the more recent science fiction shows that's out there, and I'm a big fan of it. But you know, one of the themes and the tensions within the show is that ultimately humans are more simple than what they've created. You know, it goes back to that, you know, that core idea that you were talking about. We have, you know, kind of these simplified routines, and that's in part what does make us human. But then we're forced to grapple with the complexity of the things that we've created. And how do we control them? How do we love them? How do we care for them?
How do we prevent having them tire of us?
Yeah.
One of the things I was thinking about with the replicants and with the creature in Frankenstein, and I suppose Hal, is that what makes them scary is their near similarity to us as humans. Like they're not like any of the, you know, creatures in the cartoons that have like, you know, 8 legs, they look much more like an octopus. That's far less scary than the thing that is almost us and then is not quite human. There's something that's, Freud was on about this, with the uncanny. The uncanny, yeah.
Uncanny valley.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why we get so freaked out by the android type robots that are being made.
Yeah.
They're almost human, but not quite.
Yes.
What's that Christmas train movie? That's a good example.
Polar
Oh,
Express.
yeah.
Polar
That's
Express.
creepy.
That's an example of the uncanny valley right there.
Totally.
Yeah.
Night of the Living Dead, then we do turn on each other. It is us. It is reanimated us. It is Johnny. It's my brother I just had an argument with in the cemetery, and now this horrible thing has happened, and oh, here he is, and he wants to eat me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Night of the Living Dead spawned such a massive catalog of imitators and pseudo-sequels, and the vast majority of which were produced in Italy. And this goes back to something you were touching on with the body and Catholicism, right? And I mean, if you're even remotely interested, there is a vast, dark, untapped well of just crazy nonsense that came out of Italy between, I guess, the one that opened the floodgates was Lucio Fulci's Zombie in 1979, which features an incredible sequence. I want you to Google it or YouTube it tonight. Zombie versus shark.
Oh my God.
And low budget filmmaking, it is an actual 10-foot tiger shark. It is not a special effect.
It's a real shark.
It is a 10-foot tiger shark.
Wow.
That had been given 200 pounds of horse meat prior to the stuntman going in the tank with it.
Horse tranquilizer.
No, horse meat, and then I was getting a little cue from the audience of eyeball versus splinter, which doesn't end well, but that's in there too. So not for the squeamish. Not for the
I have to see this zombie versus shark.
It's worth 5 minutes of your time.
You know, all these movies are about, you know, facing the challenge of cosmic nihilism, right? It's like, it's us and the void. It's very existential. It's
When there's
it's
no more
exit.
hell.
Yeah, that's right.
It just struck me that, I mean, I've watched probably Night of the Living Dead once, and I've seen a few zombie movies, the Brad Pitt one most recently, but
World War Z.
I mean, it strikes me as very easy plot development. I mean, because these are totally single dimension threats to us. I mean, their only motive is to eat our brains, and that's apparently to get your energy to keep moving. And if they don't eat our brains, they can't move, or something that simplistic. And it's also all these stories where it's a disease transformation, a result of an infection, and it happens in the space of seconds, and suddenly all shred of human personality is gone, and the transformation is complete in the space of seconds. I can't quite equate it with the other stuff. It's just too simple, too far-fetched. You know, in my biology in the movies, students pick our relationship with disease and things like the plague, Albert Camus' novel and stuff. And then there's all these movies where you were dealing with zombies created by viruses, and there's nothing relating to
Well, that's
real
more
science.
that's more of a modern thing. In the originals, it's not explained, and that's what probably makes it resonate even more. There's no explanation. There's no reason this should happen. In Night of the Living Dead, there's some kind of basic reference to a Venus space probe that comes back, re-enters the atmosphere in a wrong way, and there's a connection there maybe, but that's completely thrown away. But the second film, by Dawn of the Dead in 1978, there's no shred of that.
It's Cold War paranoia, isn't it? That's the ultimate, impetus or inspiration for this kind of threat.
Yes, initially, and then in Dawn of the Dead, the immediate sequel, it's about kind of like consumerism. The subtext is that we've turned into such consumers that we're just zombies roaming an empty shopping mall, because that's the place that was most meaningful to our lives. There's a whole thing about why are they here? And it's like, this place was important.
What kind of cultural or political context do you guys think accounts for kind of how the zombie has changed in pop culture? So there's a show that embarrassingly I really love. It's called iZombie,
Okay.
and it's great. It's about a young woman who becomes a zombie. She's been studying to be a doctor, and so she ends up working in a morgue and ends up becoming like a partner of this cop, and they solve crimes, and she eats the brains, and then she gets flashbacks from the people who have died and can help solve the crimes. But she's like, it's ridiculous, but watching it is amazing, and it's kind of like the new Buffy the Vampire Slayer it's a CW show, but it's like the
Buffy and Medium.
Yeah, it's like Buffy for the new gen, kind of. And there was some other movie about, it came out around like when Twilight did, about like a zombie who like this girl falls in love with, but like these zombies we can identify with, warm bodies. So like, why has there been this change from like zombies being this horrific thing, and I guess with vampires too, like the scary other, to we want to be like them, we want to date them, we want to solve crimes with them.
Well, the virus thing all comes as a reaction to the rise of HIV and AIDS, and the passing of the blood, and then with the vampire mythos, and also with the zombie thing, is that you get bitten, and then there's this process. Now, in the earlier films, it's days, but then you got like 28 days later and 28 weeks later, which are both terrific films. It's minutes. And I guess that's the ADD generation popping in.
I thought it was still seconds in those movies, in the exposure. I mean, it's 28 days to try and get out of this quarantine part of the city, is it not?
Well, in Dawn of the Dead, one of the main characters is bitten, and it's a period of days before he transitions.
Okay.
And he physically dies.
Yeah. Okay.
Whereas in 28 days later and 28 weeks later, they're the infected. They're not reanimated corpses.
It's funny, scientists who have, scientists always want to find something in popular culture to write about, and what they've done with zombies is show that there's been a transition between the very, very slow-moving zombies, where if you're a pretty good runner, and apparently in Walking Dead, you can pretty much stay away from most of them, but in some cases, the zombies have become a lot faster. And yet, considering they're all about rotting bodies, there's no real explanation for why zombies could get more athletic.
They have to ask Zack Snyder about that.
Yeah. Zack Snyder started that. Your favorite.
I just had a thought about, I'm really confused as to like, why is iZombie so popular? Like, why do I want to be buddies with like this brain-eating detective zombie medical examiner? And then I was thinking back a little bit to True Blood, which had been on HBO in previous years, and I think one of the kind of themes was that the vampires are supposed to represent like these other communities, like the LGBTQ community, who's always been, who's had all these challenges, and the vampires in True Blood blood are trying to like gain civil rights and, you know, be like everyone else, and, you know, so kind of this argument for, you know, we need rights. So like in a way it's kind of shifted to kind of these new issues of civil rights and kind of the ways in which we've been, you know, othering certain groups. That was my random thought about
I like it.
Am I
It's good, yeah. I'm only guessing, but maybe it has something to do too with like empathy, that we really want to empathize with things that are kind of inanimate or deformed or disfigured. I don't know why we'd want to do that as a culture, but there you have it.
Well, I have a thought about that.
Yeah, go for it. No, well, you know, it's called the pathetic fallacy, not because it's really pathetic, but, you know, pathos, but this idea, it's like anthropomorphizing your car, right? Or your phone. Most people are in love with their iPhone. We've got the evidence. The psychologists have ruled on that one.
Oh my God.
So yeah, so and that, you know, so we've got this like revulsive kind of like reaction to that, and yet here we are, you know, in love with zombies. What's
This is
your?
kind of wackadoo, so it could be wrong, but I think about, there's the dystopic fantasy, the idea of, I am legend, I wake up one day, and suddenly there's a new set of rules to learn, so it's a kind of adventure, and it's also a fantasy that like, the reality that we're living in is no longer, so people living underneath LA, there was some Kurt Russell movie, the 80s had a lot of this, that, you know, Back to the Future, that was sort of more charming, but the idea that like, we could wake up one day and everything's different. And the qualities that make us succeed in that world are totally different than the ones that make us succeed here. So you could have the clever older man who makes all the jokes, and you could have the strong woman who had to fight her mean husband, so now she can wield a gun, or whatever, like these new, it's the survivor idea, that there's a fantasy about that dystopia, and so then we create an enemy, and there's a reason that all the structures are down, and you get to be survivalist. And then when reality, the real world we're living in, gets increasingly scary, I wonder if there's a desire to like turn those old enemies into pals. I don't know if that's wackadoo, but I just think about, you know, how things have changed even since the 80s or even since 2016. Like, you know, maybe we want to be like, hold on a second, this is the dystopia. Now I want to reach out to the other and bring them in.
You brought up I Am Legend. I Am Legend is a novel written by Richard Matheson, which was first adapted as a film right before Night of the Living Dead. It's called Last Man on Earth.
Yeah.
And it's the prototype for Night of the Living Dead. It's shot in very similar manner. It has very similar plot contrivances, and these are vampires as opposed to zombies. But if you want to see the progenitor in Night of the Living Dead, check out Last Man on Earth.
That's before Omega Man.
Yeah, Omega Man, my all-time favorite guilty pleasure. Charlton Heston is the gun-toting Last Man on Earth, dressed as Austin Powers.
And Mary Shelley wrote The Last Man, did she not? Mary Shelley wrote another book called, was it called The Last Man?
Yeah, it's called The Last Man.
Yeah, so let's bring her back in. Come on back, Mary.
Well, I want to open it up to the audience and see what comments and questions they have for our panelists. So just jump on in.
Nerd it out, gang.
Alright.
Let's have it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things that we could talk about. The thing about the original Night of the Living Dead that comes to mind is that, you know, I think we often think of these narratives in terms of, well, if humans are often opposed to each other based on these sort of, what do we want to call it, tribal, ethnic, religious reasons, and have been feuding for generations, but there's the possibility that we all had a common enemy, we would all come together, right? I think there's this sort of guiding premise. Night of the Living Dead sort of quickly dispels that, right? These people in this house get along at times, but ultimately those relationships are severed. Then at the very end of the movie, spoiler alert, a roving group of essentially zombie militiamen who have been going around trying to eliminate the zombies that are around, you know, end up killing the living human protagonist at the end, who is of course the one character in the film who is not white, black man. And so the closing sequence is sort of these still photos that will sort of slowly get zoomed in on, and them sort of grabbing all these bodies with meat hooks and putting them onto the fire, and you see them grabbing Dwayne Jones, who plays the lead character, getting thrown onto this sort of pile of zombie corpses. think, I understand your irritation with the biological explanation for zombies, but I think it's they're merely just foils for us. So, yeah, I don't really have a question. I'm one of those commenters, no question, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like there is a thread about whether it's post-human or rejecting humanity in some ways. I don't know. There's definitely a theme that sort of spreads across these very different works. Maybe someone else can chime in on this.
Well, I have a question about different sort of dystopic visions and how to put them together. Because one of them is the routine, right, that gets mocked in a movie like Shaun of the Dead, where it's like I get up and I stumble down the hall and I'm going to the bathroom and I get brushing my teeth and I am a zombie. Like we already are zombies, and that's kind of a dystopia, that we're stuck in this routine and we want to get out and do the survivalist thing. And so that's where fantasy comes in. And then the other is, you know, the completely horrific, like we're being overrun by creatures that are faster than us, and we're completely on the bottom and destroyed. And I think about, you know, the question of like, you know, the idea that most of us kind of go through our lives with this sort of routine. I don't know if it's most, you know, because we live with both of those visions at the same time. At the same time that we have, you know, we're so comfortable that we're sick of our routine. There are also people with no routine, right? I'm thinking of like people in camps, right? Or people in, you know, situations of intense unrest, and that's masses of people who don't know, like, where's the next meal, and that's also, it's sort of, you know, William Gibson's The Future is Already Here, it's just not evenly distributed, and I think both of those scary futures are here, and what I wonder about is how to put those together and how to recognize the relationship between them. I don't know if any of you have experience in your teaching of trying to sort of make that connection, that one of these actually depends on the other, right? The I'm addicted to my iPhone depends on the conflict minerals, that, you know, those things are related, but it can be very difficult to see.
That it's a position of privilege to want to be afraid. Wait, it's a position of privilege, let me see if I get this right.
To have the routine.
To have the routine and to sit there and have the fantasy about being overrun and being survivalist, whereas if in your actual life you're constantly afraid, it's a whole different fantasy. So it's a disconnect between humans more than with zombies.
I guess it's also a sort of like, can we see that these are both visions of misery? Like in our narratives, it's not like, you know, it's not like one is really viewed as a privilege in our stories. Like, yes, we can see that that's a privilege, and we can maybe be hard on ourselves about, you know, wanting the survivalist world. But I think for me, it's more about recognizing that what we've constructed is something that is unhappy for all. They're both negative visions. Right?
There's an interesting plot device in again, we talked about this, but we're not really talking about these today. In I Am Legend, which became Last Man on Earth and then Omega Man, that there's this horrific dystopia of these night roaming creatures. In Last Man on Earth, they're vampires. In Omega Man, they're these kind of infected people who have become like a Manson-like cult and have gone back to almost a what am I looking for? It starts with an L. Goodness gracious. Luddite. Luddites. They're Luddites, and they see this man who lives in this house who has his own new routine. He gets up with the dawn. He goes out into the world trying to find these creatures and destroy them, and he must be back in his home cooking sausage or whatever as the sun falls and they come out. Well, yeah. Believe it or not, I hate that movie.
Oh, okay.
And I'm Legend.
Oh, yeah.
But the whole thing is that they have a new routine, and this is their routine. And oh my God, it'll be dark soon, and you got to get back in the house when the creatures We had a young lady in the back had a question.
It was about the zombies as foils. It wasn't really a question, but I was thinking, you were talking earlier about like bringing zombies into modern context, right? And like how we kind of honor them in a weird way. And if we think about them as foils, we're kind of saying, hey, as people, we're the real monsters, right? Versus the zombie. That's kind of what you're showing by bringing the zombies into the context. And so it's kind of a natural evolution in terms of now we bring them into modern context and we actually honor them as more human than us. We aspire to them, or we're romantically sort of inclined to them in some way. So that was my possible explanation for that.
And one thing we haven't even talked about is Bladerunner 2049. Have you seen that?
Which one is that one?
The new one with
Yeah.
Gosling
I love that one, and I love the old one too.
Terrific, right? Yeah. And the conceit there is that Tyrell pulled the ultimate trick and created a replicant who could reproduce.
And this is where, sorry to bring it back to Mary Shelley, Victor Frankenstein, like he has accomplished this amazing thing that he wanted to accomplish, and then sees what it has produced, this sort of terrible creature, which is of course all of his own doing. He's terrible because Victor neglected him. And then when he says, if you could just make me a girlfriend, I won't be lonely, and I promise to go be a vegetarian in South America, he says, I can't make this female monster, partly because they might have affection for each other and have babies. And what's really scary is that then there would be, and he uses this word, a race of individuals, a race of creatures, a race of something that would then take over the earth. And it's this kind of fear that like the thing that I've made will multiply and multiply and multiply until it all takes over. And that's of course the fear in Terminator, and it's the fear with the replicants, and not just the idea that there is a version of humanity that is totally other to me, but that they'll overtake me in a different way.
I think in Blade Runner 29, the fear is more that being human will be meaningless. That this construct can now reproduce and be something superior. This superior construct can.
But it's more than just that the artificial being has now the full biological properties. There's just been such human decay in the human condition. I mean, we've totally lost our moral center, and we have no sense of responsibility to each other, let alone the other sentient beings. I mean, the Ryan Gosling character is yearning to find out he's a robot, and he's disappointed. And I mean, the bleakness of the original human society on Earth is what makes Rutger Hauer's final his final statement so profound. Yeah, I mean, he's going to preserve a life regardless of there's no revenge motive. He's submitting to his own fate, but he values life so much. He's going to keep that for long.
Do you have a follow-up?
No, that's fine. I'm just listening.
Well, and all of these make humanity look not so great. That's the thing. It's like it's under threat. We hold it up as this thing that's clearly defined as against a bunch of other things, and that it's got to be preserved no matter what, when in fact it's the very thing that's brought about the worst. You know?
When you asked, how would these be made today? I mean, I have to think that after 50 years, we're tired of that view, and look where it's got us. I mean, we've in our popular culture been celebrating dysfunction. I mean, The Simpsons was a mirror, but everything after The Simpsons was just celebrating dysfunction and dystopia, and as if that's all we have to look forward to. Now, I mean, that to me creates a great opportunity for writers and filmmakers to try to go back to, not utopias, but at least some problem-solving view of the future where we don't paint it so beautiful.
There's been a lot of conversation about that amongst science fiction authors, right? They want to paint a more optimistic portrait. The future sucks. Why would anybody want to go there, right? You want to live in the past, which is what we did here for the last hour and a half, rather than seek out the future.
But I'm so suspicious of any nostalgia that says, oh, remember when America was so great? For example, like, nope, I don't think it was great for most people, unfortunately. So I'd be a little nervous to go back to the pre-1960s.
Good question.
I would think it would be difficult for people to write about a positive future when the science is telling us that now in, I don't know what it is, they've lowered the time now in so many odd years, the world's gonna be no longer here because of what we're doing. So, I mean, we can't fathom that. What we can fathom is it being bad.
My immediate fear is another YouTube video to check out. I think it's Boston Dynamics has created this running, jumping automaton, and then there's another company that has created this cyber dog, and all I can think about is it will not stop. You cannot reason with this. Terminator, 1984, and it's coming to pass, and this goes to larger questions that are they're addressed in Frankenstein and Bladerunner in 2001. Is somebody gonna put the brakes on this? I mean, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe what we need is a film about how human brain power is the chief limiting factor in the development of human civilization. We've botched it up so badly. Maybe we really need these cyber dogs that Boston Dynamics is creating.
But there's the Matrix. They would just become better.
But you see, Contact made the statement, how do we get through our technological adolescence? That was literally a line from the movie. It's a great statement if you're talking about the evolution of life, and certainly you get to technological intelligence and technological phase, and you have to get through it without destroying yourself. And so it's, but that statement invites responsible thinking, and that's the closest things to utopias in sci-fi are worlds where there's some big, entirely transplanetary body regulating things. I think of Bicentennial Man, scene at the end, and he's arguing, Robin Williams is arguing against hundreds of people about why he should be allowed to become fully human, but it gives the impression of a highly civilized, ordered, and wise body of people representing all of humanity being involved in decision making.
And we have had a fair number of these space movies. I'm thinking about The Arrival, where the aliens come down and they want to like let us know what we need to know. And I think about Interstellar, and then Gravity, which is terrifying. But those, I mean, that sort of, well, maybe there's a space-time continuum way that we cannot have completely botched this whole thing up. Maybe it's possible.
You know, Gene Roddenberry's vision was that we couldn't go parading around the universe as a police force unless we figured it all out on our planet. I mean, that was a nice positive view of the future. He didn't offer any solutions, but...
You mean you don't get paid? Remember that from Star Trek, oh golly, the one with the Borg. You mean you don't get paid? Because Alfred Woodard was the character from the 21st century, and Captain Picard is explaining that they don't have those visions of wealth and all that stuff.
Well, folks, we are out of time. I want to thank all of you for coming, and I especially want to thank our panelists. Please check out the Paalan Center on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, at Paalan Center, at JMU Paalan Center.
Check out my Instagram, all artwork all the time, no selfies, no foodies, no cat videos. I'm the Batman Professor on Instagram. So you'll see some more works like the ones behind us.
And since we're engaged in self-promotion, I'm at Artificial Other on Twitter.
Lucky.
Join our community.
I don't know how to tweet.
I'm waiting for somebody to be like, oh, I'm on Instagram as Phil Smells or something like that.
Thank you.
How do you reconcile the two nights?
We're back to our normal last Tuesday. Have a good weekend.
Both scenarios, zombie is very Zombies always scary.